There's a lie the Germans started telling after Russia invaded Ukraine. It goes something like this. We Germans, because of the legacy of Ostpolitik, naively put our faith in the precepts of liberal IR theory, which states that the more countries do business with each other, the less likely they are to go to war with each other. And it was because of that faith that Germany intertwined its industrial sector with Russian natural resources, in the hopes that it would deter Russia from getting aggressive with Europe. Sure, it would make Germany more dependent on Russian gas, but it would also make Russia more dependent on Germany for hard currency. There's one problem though. The Nord Stream pipelines weren't built to increase Germany and Russia's interdependency. You see, the pipelines weren't actually built to increase the volume of gas going from Russia to Germany. Physical capacity had never been the constraint. Rather, the Baltic Sea pipelines were designed to be a replacement rather than an addition to the network of already existing overground pipelines. Because those overground pipelines travel over Ukraine and Poland, and since around 2004 when Yushchenko became president of Ukraine, Putin has throttled gas deliveries through those pipelines as a political tool, which in turn cuts off Western Europe. The Nord Stream pipelines are there so that the German economy doesn't get hurt when Russia gets into a political dispute with Ukraine or Poland. That's not an increase in interdependence between Germany and Russia, it's a decrease in interdependence between Germany and Russia on one side and Poland and Ukraine on the other. If you go by the theory of naive liberalism about how trade reduces the risk of war, theoretically what the Germans would be doing is making a Russian invasion of Ukraine more likely. That's why the countries of Eastern Europe complained so bitterly about the Nord Stream pipeline. It wasn't that the Germans were naive liberals and the Eastern Europeans were hard-nosed realists. Rather, the Eastern Europeans saw it as the Germans intentionally making a war more likely according to their shared liberal IR precepts, which is exactly what the Germans were doing. Knowingly. They just did it anyway because they wanted the money. And it's easy to take calculated risks with someone else's country. The importance of that pipeline wasn't that it made Germany vulnerable to Russian economic warfare. The importance was that it sent the signal to Russia that Germany was ready and willing to sell the Ukrainians out in case of war. And that goes straight to what the war in Ukraine is about. The West, and even the Ukrainians themselves to some extent, didn't take the job of deterring a full-blown Russian invasion seriously because they thought Putin must have known somewhere deep inside that Ukraine was a real country, and that a war to invade a country of 40 million people could be made unwinnable with minimal effort. But the Russians don't think Ukraine is a real country. So unless the West pulled out all the stops to intervene, they assumed Ukraine would just fall over like a house of cards. Deterring Russia would have required something extreme, and no one wanted to make that commitment.
The president is expected to warn President Putin there will be real costs if Russia invades Ukraine.
We have made clear to Moscow that we will respond resolutely, including with a range of what we have called high-impact economic measures that we've refrained from using in the past.
So, Russia invaded Ukraine.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
It started before dawn. Ukraine woke to explosions around the capital, Kiev.
The months-long build-up of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine has turned now into an invasion.
But then a weird thing happened. To understand it though, you have to understand Russia's war goals. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, they were hoping to overthrow the government and replace it with one that would be more Lukashenkoan. An action which the Kremlin thought would be greeted with either cheers or at least indifference from regular Ukrainian citizens. When it was clear that couldn't happen, what then was Russia fighting for? Well, when they're asked, they don't really give straight answers.
А берем мы Киев или не берем, а может до Берлина дойдем, а может быть до Лиссабона. Надо бы сказать конкретно. Не надо говорить конкретно.
They can't give a straight answer, of course, because the real answer is just too humiliating. If they were to just cut their losses and withdraw back to the February 22nd line, the Americans would laugh at them. And clearly sending hundreds of thousands of kids to their death is preferable to that. But when you're only fighting to save face, you can do things like pretend you never intended to sack the capital at all. That losing the entirety of your special forces behind enemy lines in a suburban airport parking lot was just a masterful gambit to distract everyone from the real prize, Sloviansk-Kramatorsk, which they also still can't take. Normally, this kind of ass covering would not work, but in this case, in this specific war, Russia found a co-conspirator in its desire to push this narrative: Ukraine. The Ukrainians, of course, know exactly what they've been fighting for, and it was at that moment, when Russia's attack on the capital collapsed, that they saw their ultimate prize, the chance to roll back the clock all the way to 2014. So when Russia started saying that actually, so long as they didn't lose all the territory they had won in the first few days of the war, they were still winning the war. Ukrainians were eager to agree that so long as Russia still had a foothold in Ukraine, it would still constitute a Russian victory, and therefore Russia would come out of any compromise emboldened to launch further attacks on Ukraine and even other parts of Europe. So, hint hint, the West better send more aid. This is not to say the Ukrainians are wrong. At the end of the day, the perception of power is power. If everyone goes with the narrative that Russia won, Russia will be emboldened to do more stupid shit. And for a while, it didn't seem to matter. Ukraine seemed poised to win outright.
Moving overseas, and Ukrainian troops are making major gains in the country's south and northeast, putting Russian forces on the back foot.
Tonight, Ukraine is on the offensive and quickly gaining ground, reclaiming the largest swath of Russian-controlled territory since April.
But after the first few victories, a new problem started to crop up. By winning, Ukraine was whittling away its opportunities to, well, win. What was working to Ukraine's advantage was that the Russians were overstretched. The Russians lost control of 7% of Ukrainian territory, about 16,000 square miles, and were forced back to the east side of the Dnieper River. But by being pushed back across the river, the Russians suddenly had 300 fewer kilometers it needed to defend, and 16,000 square miles it no longer needed to occupy. For any further offensive, the Ukrainians would be increasingly pushing a boulder uphill. But conversely, Russia's in no position to take advantage and strike back, because Russia is fighting a war of conquest. It can't advance without committing more troops and resources behind the line in order to manage its occupation, which is why, since 2022, Russia has launched its offensive almost exclusively through barren fields and small towns. Every advance mobilizes more Ukrainians to fight, because more territorial defense units get activated, and Ukrainians in the West get more nervous about the general outcome of the war and are willing to take on more risk. Even with America out of the war, Russia just doesn't have the tools to capture a city of 1 million like Zaporizhia, let alone hold it, even though, on paper, it's already been annexed to Russia. This combination of forces just kind of lends itself to a stalemate. The battle line is settled on an equilibrium point where Russia and Ukraine are equally matched.
This war has now become a war of attrition, where the Ukrainians are paying a high price.
The midwit interpretation of this situation is that Russia has to win such a war of attrition, because it's bigger and has more stuff, so obviously Ukraine will run out first. But there are good reasons to think a war of attrition actually favors Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting a defensive war, which means it loses materiel and men at a much lower rate, and it can more easily mobilize its economy to total war since there's much less internal dissension compared to Moscow. Ukraine isn't already mobilizing now because it doesn't have to, because Russia is also afraid of throwing in too many resources. So while Russia's cheering section in the media is sure Russia will win a war of attrition, the Russian Ministry of Defense is a lot less confident. So Russia tried to make up for what it couldn't get on the battlefield by using psychological pressure, by which I mean, of course, killing random civilians.
New burst of grief in Ukraine's increasingly under fire capital. Relatives mourn not at gravesides, but by the newly covered bodies of the dead, a 9-year-old girl, her mother, and another woman killed on Children's Day.
And well, it works. Constant daily drone attacks take a hell of a toll on people's sanity. Ukrainians started to doubt that they could make it through the war without losing it long enough to win a war of attrition, even while the line stood perfectly firm on the battlefield. So, Ukraine increasingly, desperately started looking to the Americans not just to give them the tools to survive, but the tools to roll back the Russian occupation in toto, and quickly. But the Pentagon was sort of at a loss for how to provide that.
In terms of their ability to win, the first step in winning is believing that you can win.
You see, here's the thing. At the risk of making sweeping generalizations about a subject about which I have no real-world experience, as far as I can tell, the American Army doesn't really have a ground war doctrine. On paper it has a ground war doctrine, but in practice, America's ground war doctrine is,
thanks to the global coalition, including all of you here today, and to our other partners.
Together with our partners, America is training and equipping the Syrian opposition to be a counterweight.
Together with our partners.
With our partners.
Our partners.
Our partners. Our partners. With our partners.
Find someone else to be the ground troops so America can stick to close air support and logistics. This means the US has plenty of small arms and plenty of ultra-high-tech superweapons, but very little of the meat and potatoes in between. But that middling type of equipment, the self-propelled artillery, the counter-battery radars, the short-range ballistic missiles, are exactly what Ukraine needs. And it's not like there are factories around just waiting to pump out more of them. So the Pentagon is nervous about giving away too much. The advanced weapons can't be sent because America wants to protect its tech secrets, and America didn't want to send long-range missiles for fear of triggering a Russian retaliation against NATO. And I suspect the White House thought Ukraine would be capable of developing their own long-range weapon systems that would let them off the hook. Altogether, NATO is basically betting on a strategy of bleeding the Russians dry with defensive tactics until Putin gives up. A perfectly rational strategy, so long as you ignore the human cost to Ukraine. Trapped between the pressure to end the war created by Russian terror bombings and the inability of America to win the war for him, Zelensky turned to a long-shot strategy to maintain the narrative momentum of the war. He was going to have to launch another daring offensive. But where to do it? The low-hanging fruit had already been picked. There were really only two areas in Ukraine where an assault would be plausible. The Donbass, where Russia was throwing the mass of its troops in an ongoing offensive, or the south, behind which lied the land bridge that connects Crimea to the rest of Ukraine, and by extension, Russia's most important supply line. The Ukrainians decided to hit the south. It was the most obvious place to hit. The Russians had their troops concentrated elsewhere, the land is flat, and the territory is of vital importance. The problem, though, is that the south was the most obvious place to hit. The Russians had their troops concentrated elsewhere, the land is flat, and the territory is of vital importance, which means the Russians were expecting to be hit there. So the second the Russians retreated across the river, they started building line after line of defensive earthworks. The more time they had to prepare, the thicker the defenses got, which meant for any assault, time would be of the essence. But up to that point, the Americans hadn't been training the Ukrainians on quote-unquote offensive weapons. Doing it now would take months, giving the Russians lots of time. But with no better ideas to go on, Ukraine began preparations for an offensive in the spring. In the meantime, a quiet bureaucratic fight started to break out inside the Ukrainian military, between the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, and the commander of the ground forces, Oleksandr Syrsky. While Zaluzhny was in charge of the overall war effort, Syrsky was in charge of the Donbass front. Syrsky became convinced that with enough extra troops, he could rout the Russian mercenaries of Wagner Group in the eastern town of Bakhmut and push deep into occupied Luhansk. But Zaluzhny had already committed himself to a plan to push south, with only a small diversionary attack in the east, reserving all of his new, specially trained by the American recruits for the main front. But when spring finally came, nothing. The Americans were late with some of the aid, and Zelensky didn't want to risk putting the army in the position of fighting the first half of the battle, only to be left empty-handed during the second half. So he waited, again, against the wishes of his commanders, and the Americans. It was at this point, allegedly, that Syrsky went behind his superior's back to Zelensky and personally promised him that Bakhmut could be a big showy victory, that Wagner was on the cusp of breaking, and if he, Syrsky, were just given some of those specially trained American troops, he could lead a breakthrough behind the lines into Luhansk province and rout the Russians on the entire east. Given the delay, Zelensky was probably losing confidence in the original offensive plan, but not wanting the bad PR of calling it off, he chose the worst of both worlds. He split his forces up and gave a third of them to Syrsky for his Bakhmut offensive. Instead of trying for a defeat in detail, the Ukrainians would fight undermanned on two different fronts. But for a second it seemed to work.
А теперь слушайте меня, сука, блядь. Это чьи-то, блядь, отцы.
The mercenary company in charge of defending Bakhmut, the Wagner Group, took such bad losses that its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, began threatening other ministers of the government, and implicitly even Putin himself, culminating in Prigozhin's decidedly silly decision of trying to overthrow the Russian government.
Hours earlier, Wagner forces seized the city of Rostov-on-Don on Russia's southern border.
And then calling it off when he got halfway there, and pretending it was just a sort of coup-like performance art protest.
By nightfall, Wagner forces appeared to be making good on their word to withdraw. The Kremlin was also making peace, saying Prigozhin will no longer face criminal charges and instead will relocate to next-door Belarus.
The missile that shot down his plane and killed him, however, did not stop halfway. Russia's political system remained stable, and Syrsky's legacy would seem to primarily be memes about Prigozhin. With the hope of Russian political instability saving the day dashed, and the main offensive force too undermanned to break through, the offensive sputtered to a halt on both fronts. The failed offensive was not a particularly big disaster when it came to the actual balance of forces on the battlefield, but it had a catastrophic effect on Western public opinion. Within a month, support for aid to Ukraine dropped 13 points and opposition rose 12 points, almost reaching a majority. All the people who had tacitly supported Russia before the invasion, but who during the war had to keep their heads down after the slaughter started, suddenly started feeling safe popping their heads back up again to start spreading defeatism. And the foreign policy blob in Washington, whose first instinct is always towards power worship, started nattering about how Ukrainians need to be more realistic and start thinking about compromises. This damage to American resolve was then compounded by Zelensky's need to explain away the failure of the offensive to his own people, which Zelensky did by blaming the West. Since after all, the West had been late with the aid, and had been dragging their feet on the aid the entire war. But that sent the message to Ukraine's try-hard cheerleaders in the West that they should start ringing the alarm bells about America betraying the Ukrainians by withholding this or that wonder weapon. A given type of equipment would be paradigm shifting right up until the point that the West delivered it, at which point, just coincidentally, it would suddenly be too late for that equipment to make a difference. When, in reality, such equipment would only have a marginal impact on the course of the war. This game of two-step is a perfect way to squeeze more aid out of a hyper-cautious White House, but it also involved a lot of cycling between false promises the war would be turned around, and false threats that the front would collapse soon without the new weapons. If this campaign to shift blame to the White House had simply made the relationship between Biden and Zelensky frosty, it wouldn't be such a big deal, but the focus on the catastrophic consequences of a Ukrainian collapse and the panicky tone much of it was delivered gave the impression that Ukraine was on the brink of giving up. This was being done in the hope that it would scare the West into giving up more aid. But there's one problem, which is that you can't control who hears you say these things. If you broadcast a message in the West that you don't have the will to fight unless you get substantially more help, you're also broadcasting that message to the Russians, thus bolstering their will to fight. The second problem is that this revival of domino theory in Europe didn't convince Americans of the necessity of bolstering Ukrainian aid, so much as it convinced Americans that Europe was helpless and not carrying its own weight. After all, why the hell should a place as rich as Europe be so vulnerable to a second-rate power like Russia? In 2023, it seemed, every week, military analysts who had spent early 2022 predicting Ukraine would collapse in 3 days were now assuring us with the same confidence that Europe, or at least the Baltics, would also easily fall to a Russian onslaught after Russia was done with Ukraine, and that this was the result of sort of decadent post-historical complacency on the part of the Europeans. In other words, Europeans were just too gay and welfare dependent to spend enough on their military to deter or defeat a Russian attack, and America was spending billions to carry all the weight. In reality, Europe's defenselessness is being just slightly exaggerated. The arguments mostly hinge on the idea that the war in Ukraine supposedly proves that modern war has become an attritional slog, because after all, the war in Ukraine has become an attritional slog, and Europe does not have large reserves of ready or near-ready fighting vehicles or troops to break out in case of an emergency. So it can safely be assumed Europe will quickly run out in a war with Russia and fall back. The problem, of course, is that the only reason the war is a slog is that both sides are fighting with last-generation airplanes but current-generation air defense systems. Europe does not have a last-generation air force. They have a modern air force, with modern stealth capability. They are not going to be stopped in their tracks by a bunch of Buk launchers. And unlike Russia, Europe has not neglected its naval power. Italy alone has a more powerful navy than Russia. Even a post-American rump NATO has a good chance of being able to bottle up most of Russia's water-based trade. And while Europe has been slow to develop its industrial capacity when it comes to helping Ukraine, that is, at its core, a political decision. They're simply prioritizing other things higher. Europeans will suddenly find the power in themselves to build much more quickly once it's their ass on the line. This European freeloader argument also dovetailed with a new line of Russian propaganda that had taken off in the summer of 2023. In a June interview, Vladimir Putin just kind of blithely let it slip that actually, about a month or two after the war started, Ukraine was just about to sign a ceasefire deal, but then pulled out at the last moment, under pressure from the West. And this deal was, according to Putin, a more generous deal than what Ukraine could get now. You see, all Putin had really wanted was a promise to keep Ukraine out of NATO. He didn't really care about Ukraine's internal affairs, or even if it signed a bilateral defense agreement, so long as it wasn't NATO. This meant, of course, According to Vladimir Putin, Ukraine had the option in the summer of 2022 of ending the war right then and there with good security guarantees and no real obstacle to its European integration. So, why didn't they take the deal? Well, you see, the people who run American foreign policy are congenitally evil and love war for war's sake, and so they sent their most subtle diplomat, a man who can be trusted to always stay on script, Boris Johnson, to convince Zelensky to walk out on the deal and keep fighting. Needless to say, this is not what happened. In fact, you can pretty quickly deduce what actually led Ukraine to say no by carefully reading the description of the security guarantee clause in the Russian offer. In this formulation, Ukraine's security partner would be a consortium between certain Western countries and the UN Security Council, with both the UNSC and the other countries needing to agree in order to approve an intervention in Ukraine against any foreign assault. But those countries would only be able to intervene in Ukraine against foreign aggression with the consent of the UNSC. But Russia, of course, has a veto on the Security Council, which means Russia was, under the guise of letting Ukraine have a security agreement, awarding itself a veto on any country's ability to intervene on Ukraine's behalf if Ukraine were to be invaded by, say, hypothetically, Russia. To turn this into a story of the West sabotaging a promising peace deal to satisfy, Jake Sullivan's inexplicable thirst for blood, or even just a story about the Ukrainians boneheadedly turning down a pretty good deal out of post-victory exuberance, it's perverse. But it lent itself to something people wanted to believe, that Russia was actually more reasonable than it appeared, and there actually was a sustainable ceasefire deal to be made, with the only drawbacks being national pride. Were it only so. This combination of the failed counteroffensive, the resentment of European helplessness, and this new alleged proof that the war had actually been unnecessary, created a new consensus that it was time to force Ukraine to end the war. Or as Americans preferred to formulate it to avoid feeling guilty, it was time for America to stop forcing Ukrainians to fight by giving them the weapons they asked for. And that new consensus created a perfect way in for a more entrepreneurial politician to pitch his new foreign policy ideas.
I will end every single international crisis that the current administration has created, including the horrible war with Russia and Ukraine, which would have never happened if I was president.
As he told it now, Americans were victims of a globalist elite and their European allies, who had started and needlessly prolonged the war for abstract ideological reasons like democracy and liberalism. If Donald Trump had been president, the war never would have started, because he's strong, whatever that was supposed to mean. And once he became president again, he would immediately end it, because he was on good terms with Putin, which meant once he got in, he could get a good deal.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I want the war to stop. I want to save lives. We're in for $250 billion or more because they don't ask Europe, which is a much bigger beneficiary to getting this thing done than we are. I know Zelensky very well and I know Putin very well. I have a good relationship and they respect your president, okay? They respect me. They don't respect Biden. How would you respect him? Why? For what reason? But we have a president,
Mr. President,
that doesn't know he's alive.
Your time.
This rhetorical stance was perfectly designed to trick everyone at once. He could appeal to doves by promising a quick end to the war, with a strong implication that he would do it by cutting off aid to Ukraine and force them to make concessions to Russia. But simultaneously, he could appeal to hawks by making vague appeals to his toughness, in a way that implied he was going to use a sort of madman theory of diplomacy which would scare Russia into making their concessions. This shouldn't have worked on Ukraine supporters, but the growing schism between Biden and Zelensky and the media campaign to exaggerate the effects of American aid delays had alienated many Ukraine supporters from Biden, and some increasingly started thinking that maybe Trump would be the lesser evil. Either way, Trump would give Americans the thing they wanted most in Ukraine, the ability to not have to see or think about Ukraine in the news anymore. It's that urge, ultimately, that carried him to the White House.
Is this a call, ladies and gentlemen? We are now projecting that Donald J. Trump will win the state of Pennsylvania.
Now it was time to implement his plan. Or it would be, if not for the small problem that he didn't have a plan.
Do you think Donald Trump thought it was going to be this hard, this challenging? I mean, on the campaign trail, he said day one, it'd be fixed.
Yeah, well, he was asked about this, why he said, in 24 hours he would have a deal, and he said that he was being sarcastic.
Trump's campaign promise version of the plan would never work, of course. American aid doesn't give Washington enough leverage to force Ukraine to surrender, and Trump was clearly not a madman, so any bluff against the Russians was doomed to fail. And Trump caved to Russia pretty immediately. That left the current plan of just trying to ease the Russians and Ukrainians into a sequence of partial ceasefires and hoping that you can just kick the can down the road where it can trip up the next Democratic administration. But then even that plan blew up.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
If you will speak very loudly about the war,
He's not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly. Your country's in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No,
Can
you've
I
done a lot
answer?
of talking.
Part of the problem here is that the Trump White House is torn between multiple contradictory campaign promises. On one hand, Donald Trump promised to end the war quickly. On the other hand, the populist right feels that America has been taken advantage of by the globalist elites, and therefore America must be paid back. But putting pressure on Ukraine emboldens Russia to ask for more, which makes Trump feel like a sucker. Which means instead of American pressure on Ukraine being focused on one point of just getting them to make concessions to Russia, the pressure is diverted three ways. Between extortion of the Ukrainians for natural resources, pressure on Ukraine to make concessions to Russia, and pressure on Russia to make concessions to Ukraine, which just ends up canceling out the pressure on Ukraine. At first, it seemed like the square was circled by creating a mineral deal in which Ukraine would give up 50% of the proceeds from mineral deposits it actually couldn't really exploit anyway, giving the populists the appearance that they would get paid back all the money the globalists forced them to spend on Ukraine. But then the White House had to make the process so humiliating that Zelensky couldn't say yes without jeopardizing his own image.
Why don't you wear a suit? Why don't you wear a suit? You're at the highest level in this country's office, and you refuse to wear a suit. Just want to see if you do you own a suit?
Yeah, problems.
A lot of Americans.
Senator Rubio, you've taken a very different approach to the question of Russia. You've called Vladimir Putin a, quote, gangster. Why would President Rubio's approach be more effective than President Trump's?
Well, first of all, I have an understanding of exactly what it is Russia and Putin are doing, and it's pretty straightforward. He wants to reposition Russia once again as a geopolitical force. He himself said that the destruction of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And now he's trying to reverse that. He's trying to destroy NATO.
Russia is also trapped in a bind. It has a large swath of territory it doesn't really want to administer, and is therefore valueless to Putin. But if Russia trades that territory back to Ukraine in exchange for a promise that Ukraine will stay neutral, and maybe even recognition of Russia's claim on Crimea, they would essentially have to admit they launched the war for no reason, since they already had both of those things de facto. There's also the matter of the Russian economy, which has baffled some casual observers. With the sanctions, the flight of the professional class, and the massive divestment of resources into the war, analysts, particularly geopolitical analysts for whom economics is black magic, expected much more damage to the Russian economy. Perhaps unintuitively, the secret to Russia's resilience lies in its deep economic dysfunction. Russia is a deeply unequal country. Not just in the sense that the rich are very rich and everyone else is very poor, but also geographically. The rich are concentrated in a handful of cities, and a great mass of people eke out a meager living in the provinces through a combination of odd jobs and pension checks. That meant when Russia needed manpower, in both the trenches and the factories, they didn't have to get it by cannibalizing productive sectors of the economy. There was already a massive bonus army of marginally employed provincials to pick from. The money to pay those people then came from two sources. One, seizing it from the rich, and two, printing rubles, which in effect mostly squeezes value out of Russia's small, benighted middle class, who are rich enough to have savings, but not rich enough to have it denominated in gold in a Swiss bank account. In other words, the war is providing Russia with a badly needed opportunity to redistribute wealth. In fact, in a country as unequal as Russia, it's perfectly possible that the quality of life for the median Russian has actually gone up. But that doesn't make the war sustainable. Russia still needs hard currency to buy and build weapons, and to keep its currency from collapsing. But the Kremlin doesn't get enough hard currency from oil sales to simultaneously maintain the welfare state, pay soldiers' salaries, and stabilize the ruble all at the same time. That is, without dipping into savings, in the form of its sovereign wealth fund. After 3 years of war, it's burnt through at least half of its gold reserves. At least, that's as much as they're willing to admit. But Russia isn't just sacrificing the comfort of the oligarchs and the middle class, it's also sacrificing the sources of its long-run growth. And if the war only lasted 3 days, that would not be a problem, but long run was 3 years ago. So while Russia has been able to transition to a war economy, transitioning back into a consumption economy is a much trickier and dangerous prospect. People have higher expectations for peace than they do for war. Putin will need all sanctions off in order to get back to normal, and Trump can't force the Europeans to drop their sanctions. And European sanctions aren't the only thing the EU has agency over in this conflict either. With the exception of the Patriot missiles, most of the weapons Trump might cut off can be backfilled or replaced by the Europeans. At least, if there's enough political will to pull out the stops. And while the Europeans have been slow to reform in the past, a flakier, Trumpified US might finally give them the kick they need. I hope. Third time's the charm, right? In fact, there's a sick way in which Trump's election might be good for Ukraine. And it goes back to what this war is fundamentally all about. You see, there's a lie the Americans started telling right around the time of the first Gulf War. It goes something like this.
What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order.
After World War II, the United States created something called the Liberal International Order, which has long guarded vigorously and consistently, and only now, in the 2020s, are we in danger of losing it.
But the greatest threat on this front springs from the distinct illiberal and external actors who equate their success with fracturing the liberal international order.
The truth is that when it comes to upholding international law, America's contribution to upholding the world order has always been scattershot and inconsistent. Even when America wants to punish a country for violating international law, it usually settles for a less than effective strategy of sanction and wait. The one alleged exception is the taboo on big countries annexing territory from small countries. The precedent set by, of course, the war to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein's unprovoked invasion, his ruthless, systematic rape of a peaceful neighbor, violated everything the community of nations holds dear. The world has said this aggression would not stand, and it will not stand.
In reality, national borders have mostly been self-reinforcing. In the age of popular participation in politics, rising nationalism, and cheap machine guns, ruling over a foreign country became more and more expensive over the course of the 20th century. The people are much less indifferent to who rules over them than they were in the 19th century. And if they don't like you, they can give you hell. There are now very few things a power can get by invading and occupying a country that it couldn't more easily get through the more subtle tools of coercive diplomacy. That's why there hasn't been much in the way of annexation since World War II. You can see the problem in action today. In Gaza, Israel doesn't want to leave Gaza without getting some kind of concrete win, but they don't want to expend the resources that would come with an occupation. So they have simply settled for committing mass atrocities on and off until the global community, out of some sense of pity, just bails the Israelis out of their dilemma by relocating the people of Gaza for them. A bailout that is almost certainly not coming. A big three-way size disparity, like the one between America, Kuwait, and Iraq, could act as one exception, but such an alignment of circumstances is so unlikely it never happened again. Aside from little Kuwait, the taboo on changing borders by force has been mostly self-enforcing, but it didn't hurt America's image to take credit for the kind of peaceful state of the world in the 1990s. So, they did. And now, certain people have taken America's own propaganda too seriously, and think American decline makes all sorts of new conquests possible. The Russian theory of victory in Ukraine is based on the idea that the liberal international order is real, but somehow entirely the product of American coercion. Therefore, all they have to do is defeat the US in a battle of wills, and once Americans give up, the occupation of Ukraine will go swimmingly. Well, now the US has given up, and Ukraine is still not rolling over. The longer the Ukrainians can hold out without American help, the less credible their theory of victory becomes. And the Kremlin will eventually have to face up to the fact that they have embarked on a forever war. This would require, needlessly, a massive sacrifice on the part of the Ukrainian people. Maybe bigger than they already have, but what choice do they have? And I just want to give a heartfelt thanks to my patrons who've been so patient. Next year will be more productive, I promise. Deckerhoff, Hans Peter, valid user, Marcin P., Richard Rorden, Tsunami State, I Solved AGI, White Oak, Tom Mogul, Bird Nerd, Istvan Bojo, Stylized Integrity, Broke, Geopolitical Idiot, Ari Eden, Soma Lover, Christian Bickle, Matthew Torres, Heatstroke Arccrite, Cryptic, Dracone at Quellen.tv, SVPPB, The Dutch Musician, David Leake, Space Octopus, Name Redacted, Arminius317, Soviet Baguette, Oblio, Wojtek Yurka, Chris McGuire, Chris A., Flip der Wilde Valdi, Labizi, Yal Nusra Punk, Peyton Miller, Literally Bismarck, Konstantin Brilov, E., Neo-Matrixism, Still Want Wilkie, Happy Taffy, Turbo Encabulator, Chris Rubbert, Colin Herrera, Fuck the Cheneys Foundation, Aaron Polari, Carl Casper, Stinky Stan Enjoyer, Ian Fredenberg, Rusty, Rin Walker, Arthur Wiedemann, Politics Gaming, Yasin Atanasov, The Business Goose, Panzercat, Time is Fleeting, The Internet's #1 Herbert Hoover stan, Shell Shock by Social, Lemming, N. Gladstein, Poseidon Buoy Torture, Benji Smith, Scurvy Kerr, Insane Vladimir, Rowan Munt or his evil clone, Peter, Cody Rickman, Dutch Tom, Tiaz, Eric Patterson, Fabian Garden, Diocletian, Hadar Milner, Propylane, Mr. Lava Lava, Dracula, Martin Kurian, Hopsan, Kian Hammer, Alex the Apologetic, that his name is too long, Bobby G, Bear River Vaquera, Archer Black, Admiral A, Finn Bortle, Lumber Jacques Cousteau, Deadass Reagan, Arjun Von Dahlen, Professor Giraffenstein, Creation Scientist, Stylish Hobo, Calvin Garbitzik, Dirtlegerg, Ethan Jackson, Ian Woods, Robert Falla, Owen O'Neill, Sub-Phoenix La La La, Daniel B., Dmitry Ponomarenko, Nick T., Arctic Sea, Travis Bennett Video, Pablo Gonzalez, Patrick Bender, ODST Shax, Auto Expert, Uncomfy, Nathan C. Tupper, Revengeance Musical, Jake Streamer, Chop Macabre, Glenn Arrow, Jack Bragi, Christoph Kaczynski, Love Letters, Daniel Frey, Jennifer McCanna, Gary Oakes Girth, Matthias Hoop, Anthony Gincola, Friedrich Arndt, I. Ratman, Christopher DeClerc, Deadmoo 53, Alexi, Rosie the Cat, Vault Breaker, Tired and Emotional, Cop Creature Shop, Dr. Majalis, Texture, Jacob Thompson, Display GFX, Trashiest Posflint, Chris Hanshoe, Beyond, Derek, Gabriel Deards, Jerry Makovsky, 123456789, Peanut Supreme, John Miller, Yang Wei Feng, Game Warrior 010, Totally Useless, Dust Heartman, James Lynch, Crispy Bacon, Bernth, Aki665, Old Drippy, Ananas, Taboon, Zoobeers, Watch the Anime Cat Planet Cuties, Null, Alan Wake, That's Good Broth, Arianai, Red Rex, Garpenlov, Armin Huneberg, Telexv, Carl Nyo, B. Quinn, Sir S., Sean Oscar, Fold Out Chair, Joel Gomez, Gabo Tsai, Scott Beckett, Zach Christensen, Jerome Rasky, Horse Course, Knowing Better, Nate Rice, Tedsville, Kimma, Spoderman, Aaron, Fogkiten, Jacob Lisi, Big Nove, Elia, Diana Banana, and last but not least, Kitten of the Yarn Persuasion.